Dr. Lichtman, you had mentioned that you used the methodology to develop the keys and applied it to other problems, including the Netflix problem. Could you kind of step through an outline of how you would apply this methodology to other problems, especially some of the ones that are more intractable, like that don't work with algorithms?
Because I kind of alluded to it, and I can't disclose the methodology, but I've used in proprietary content. But here's how it works. First of all, you've got to define a binary prediction. Yes, no. Who's going to win, who's going to lose, hit or not hit. And for presidential elections, that's pretty easy, or for elections in other countries. But for other problems, that can be difficult. What is a hit movie? What is not a hit movie? And in many ways, the success of your prediction depends upon that definition. Then once you do that, you do your rich prediction. You go back and see what movies, according to your criteria, were hits and not hits. And you see what factors in the social world and the economic world are associated with hits and not hits. Who's in the movie, the length of the movie, the topic of the movie, the time of release. I'm not saying those are the ones you should use, but those are the kinds of things you could look at. And then there are way more sophisticated pattern recognition programs now than what we used in 1981. And you, again, put those in binary form, and you get a whole series of vectors, and the pattern recognition program will come up with the combination of factors that best predicts your binary outcome. And by the way, there were other smaller subsets when I developed the keys that worked retrospectively, but I rejected them because this set created the greatest separation. So it's not just getting it right, it's also creating the greatest separation in your decision. And it turned out if I had adopted any subset of the 13 keys, I would have been wrong in some of my predictions.
Any other questions?
Jake, how much would it have helped you and Travis if all those papers that you mentioned had published their data and scripts? And then a question for the whole panel, how important is it for that burgeoning trend to continue in the academic literature?
Yeah, I think it would have helped quite a bit. So certainly been a proponent of that. It would have helped in the sense that we could more easily see the differences between what's going on. But I think also there would still be this incoherency between what was actually done in the narrative as well. So there's this kind of abstraction of this. Okay, can we replicate exactly what was done quantitatively? That would be nice to do. But I don't think that's necessarily as big of a problem as this disconnect between, okay, we say we're all solving the same problem, but actually we're solving different versions of that problem. And that can kind of be assessed without doing a quantitative replication. It's just kind of careful and critical. So I think the quantitative bit, getting the data, allowing, I think what it would have helped was allowing other people to go ahead and try different versions of what those folks have done. That would have been the valuable part. I think assessing, are we all kind of in this fractured landscape of different things can happen without that. Certainly be very useful.
Thanks very much to the panel. It was a fascinating series of discussions today. I wanted to ask, in light of all the types of models we went over today, have you noticed in the course of your careers a shift in terms of the stakeholder expectations of whether they want it to be more quantitative now over time, how they want uncertainty to be expressed, or does it all come down to the grandma rule as we started off with, or even just know your stakeholder? So just kind of curious on your observations.
I think there's definitely been a trend towards favoring more quantitative models, and it's pretty clear that numbers have a power to them. You read the New York Times, today, and there's numbers sort of kicked around as evidence for this statement or that statement. And if you read the New York Times from 60 years ago, it was much more qualitative type reasoning. So we use numbers as a way of bolstering the arguments that we make, and quantitative modeling is part of that process of persuading whoever's reading about the results that we have authority in some ways. But I think if you think about the kinds of sort of meta statements that were made in all the presentations today, what we're saying is that numbers alone are not trustworthy, that you have to ask how to interpret them. And I think Jake's point about the researcher degrees of freedom is a really beautiful way of pointing out that knowing what number to even calculate is itself a hard problem. And that's where most of the debate should be happening, because today, with the kinds of tools that computer scientists have built for the world, it's easy to do quantitative modeling. You can pull TensorFlow off the web, you can build your neural networks, you can get these numbers, but have you actually done anything useful? That's not a question a machine can answer for you. That's a question that only a human can answer. And a human has to understand what the machine doesn't. It has to say, a human has to be able to say, well, I've measured these things, but are they the right things? These numbers are biased, or they have, they're incomplete in some way. Those are only things that a human can know. And so I think that the future of this kind of trend is that the data science tools that are becoming incredibly popular today are a tool in a toolbox for humans to do better thinking, very careful, thoughtful work about understanding the underlying processes. What machines allow us to do well is to see patterns in large data sets that would be too tedious for a human to go through by hand, but they don't allow us to reason about what those things mean. So in some sense, I think about these tools as giving human superpowers, right? It's like X-ray vision. You can see things that you couldn't see before, but they don't let you solve problems. You can still be evil if you have X-ray vision, right?
Very quick follow-up. Beware the fallacy of false precision. You can have huge numbers, complicated mathematical models, but that doesn't mean they're right.
So I'll answer slightly differently to say that for any of you here, and most of us have the opportunity to provide reports to higher ups, people still want to be told what the answer is, even regarding all these other things. They want to know what to do, and they don't want ambiguity in that most of the time, because ambiguity is confusing and upsetting. So I would say that even as we add more data, even as we add more answers that have numbers and probabilities versus binary outcomes, people still want to know answers. The second thing I would say is I really want to reiterate what both Jake and Aaron have pushed, which is that question design becomes increasingly important in a world of higher computation. More data is accessible, more analytics tools can run things really quickly, and so it's even more imperative to think through what you are actually solving. Everyone has examples that, like what Jake was showing there, in which you look at papers across time, you look at answers across time to important questions, and you realize that the differences are derived in part by the data and in part by the analytics, but even so, they're just answering different questions. So even access to everything would lead you to still be say, like, they could both be correct to key questions, because they're actually solving very different things. And then the third part I would say is when it comes to precision, frequently we're tasked with tools that lead to more automated decisions. We're tasked with things that can make more complicated regular decisions actions, and so it's increasingly important that you understand how to make predictions that can actually lead directly to allocation of resources versus a more qualitative world maybe that wasn't as important. But as you think through different questions involving regular allocation of resources, if you're thinking about things like threat assessment, in which you're constantly moving money around and moving resources around, maybe even on a daily basis to hit targets, then that becomes increasingly critical, that it actually solves the answer and actually provides enough depth in order to make it useful. And then I would to that last point, Alan's point, of course, like, you don't want to give false over precision, but that's generally what people are demanding. The principle is demanding, and so it is important to kind of weigh those carefully. Have a well-defined question, and answer it with error that justifies what you're doing.
I wanted to build on that just a little bit, and also come back to the previous speaker's second question, which was, I think that as computation and quantification becomes more common in the way we make decisions in our discourse, it's actually even more important that we publish the methods themselves. So it should be unacceptable today to release a scientific report and to have the data be proprietary and hidden from other interested parties, researchers, et cetera, from being able to inspect that data and the methods. And so I think that it's important to release both the data and the code that computed that on that data, if that code is non-trivial. If you can describe what you did in terms of analyzing it in text, and it's clear and unambiguous, and somebody could read that and say, okay, I can write that myself, then fine, like you don't have to release the code. But if it's non-trivial at all, then you should put everything out there for other people to inspect. Otherwise, the question should be, what are you hiding, I think. So I think the principle of open science is one that we should increasingly embrace so that we can inspect each other's reasoning, especially when that reasoning is based on complicated data sets or complicated statistical models or code.
Maybe I can add one thing there. So I totally agree with that. The only part I disagree with is that even in the case where it seems like you can describe it simply in text, we actually have an example looking at police bias from the summer where it's a simple logistic regression model. You can read everything, it looks fine, and without the code, you can't reproduce the results. And so it's quite terrible. But a second point, and this is kind of going back to David's point about, and Alan's point about false precision and people wanting that communicated, I think something that's underappreciated, especially as we have more and more of these decision aids, is getting the collaboration of a person and an algorithm to work better than either one alone. And something that's gone back to the 70s is this idea that usually the statistical model, these simple statistical models, whether they're checklists or they're rounded, linear weighted models, that sort of thing, seem to beat people on aggregate in the long run. And yet we have this sense that we have this intuition that should be able to help. But time and time again, when people sort of pair algorithm and model, you don't do better than the model alone for many cases. And so I think there's a lot more research into how to get that collaboration to work better, whether it's how you communicate uncertainty and probabilities, or other types of interpretability in those models. So I think that's increasingly going to be an important part of research going forward.
Dan?
Thank you. I've got two questions. Dr. Rothschild, I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer Joe Zika's earlier question about were you able to observe any of evidence of foreign influence in all the data you looked at? And Dr. Hoffman, a question about when you're trying to predict the spread of information, how does the fact that more and more internet activity is the result of bots and other automated systems, is that skewing the data and making it more difficult, or how is that affecting that prediction?
So let me add in a couple of parts. So the first thing is that on publicly available data that people use to track elections, there have been many different manipulation attempts directly at that. So this is not the exact question you're asking, but I think it's important to recognize both polling and prediction markets have been attacked in various ways. In 2012, there was a single investor who worked to manipulate the price of Romney to win the election, keep it higher than it obviously would have been otherwise. Whether or not that investor was an American-based investor trying to increase people's confidence so that they would invest in the Romney campaign to have a virtuous cycle, or whether or not there were some other personal motives, it's not clear, but that person lost several $1 million in expectation and well, actually several $1 million, even more in reality, buoying that price during the course of the election cycle. That's always something to be thinking about with the prediction side. On the actual election attacks, so I do a lot of work in understanding paid and earned media and basically how it's affecting public opinion, and there are a couple of key things. Number one is that there's a lot of attention right now towards understanding attacks in social media, understanding fake news in general, and my first word of caution for everyone to remember is that about 0.1% of media consumption, less than 1% of news media is anything that we would consider in the realm of swampy media, whether or not it's fake, outright fake, hyper-partisan, otherwise low information. Is an extremely low percentage of total news consumption. And so when you're looking at what people know and don't know about elections in general, not thinking about the extreme right now, mainstream media needs more attention itself, because that's where a lot of people learn things or don't learn things, right? And so Pizzagate was not something that the average voter knew about. That was an extreme case in which hyper-partisans were well aware of, but questions about Hillary Clinton's IT security that may have been done in bad faith, that was a much bigger issue, and those are definitely still something to be worried about, because as we move forward in how people are going to attack elections, working through the mainstream media and trying to push these marginal issues that have truth, but are probably not the right thing for people to be focusing on, is a more effective and meaningful way than actual outright fake lies and things like that, especially as you look at the veracity of the president on various issues and how that streams through the mainstream media. When it comes to actually understanding what's going on in the attacks, when you look at kind of actual fake news coming through, there is some of the things that I know of and I've been working on is just regular understanding of how much people know and how much that spreads. So polling, social media, online browsing data to try to understand that. I think that the biggest worry is in activating extremists more than it is in necessarily hitting the average voter in the democracy. But there is some really interesting stuff in utilizing various data to kind of on a regular basis update which is breaking through and which is not from kind of this combination of hyperpartisan and fake. And then the third thing I would say, and as I said, it doesn't spread that far, but it's a very much worried on extremity, and I think there's be some great stuff coming out, ways to track these more regularly. And then the third thing I would say is that ultimately, when it comes to the tracking of the data, that this is a continuously moving target because, as I said, the things that people are doing are adapting. The Russians, took many different approaches in 2016. They did paid advertisement. They did earned media engagement. They pushed fake stories. They accelerated stories that were already in the know. And if the Russians are optimizing, they're going to continue to push towards the space of kind of creating fractions between Democrats by pushing actual things that are out there. So there's going to be Democratic losers, just like Bernie Sanders in 2016. Pushing no voting based off of Bernie Sanders supporters versus Hillary Clinton supporters was a very effective route, and I expect them to be pushing more into those types of things. And when it comes to paid versus earned, we spend a lot of time, and the media has been talking a lot about paid media, but earned media is basically a cheaper, more effective option. If you think about the fact that they need to go through paid media, they need to pay same prices as people here, but they can use cheap labor to push more on earned media. And so the real threat is going to be in the earned media space. It's going to be in pushing these stories in the fringes of different social media, as well as, of course, getting things out into the mainstream, jumping those stories into the mainstream media.
Any other comments from the panelists on that topic? No?
Should
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
can address that
Yeah.
second question about the bots. So one interesting thing I've seen doing industry research for a while is a lot of things I work on are trying to understand what people do, and inevitably we bump into learning about what separates people from machines. And so I'm sort of hopeful that we can do a reasonable job of this sort of identification of what looks non-human as far as these bots go, because I think if you measure enough things, you eventually get to the point where the behavior of an account, let's say, is so constrained that it can't be more effective than a human would be at doing something. The question of, if you have enough of those, does it cause a problem is kind of an interesting one. And, I haven't directly looked at how this affects predictability, but I think hearkening back to what sort of Dave said this morning is it certainly makes for a non-stationary environment, right? And so if we take things that we did in 2012 and try to apply them now, models need to be retrained, things need to be updated. And I think that's the key thing, is that it's really just not a static platform. And so this idea that you can have this stable model in a situation like that and carry it forward in time, I think is really difficult.
Yeah, and I'd add one more thing, which is that I guess something that Alan was jumping around, which is this question of what are campaign effects and how much we should worry about them, right? So if you can create a stable model, 4 years in advance, 10 years in advance, whatever, over what election's going to be, then you do need to then question, what does that mean? Does that mean that you believe that the actual campaigns don't matter at all? Do you believe that the net effect of the campaign is essentially washed out? Or is the campaign actually being picked up by these points on the fundamental model? And I think there are decent arguments that go to a lot of different things, but the interesting fact of 2016 on how people think about it is that 2016 was the most asymmetric election campaign we've ever seen, right? So a previous election, you're likely to see much more equality in paid advertisement, in types of groundwork that was being done. This was a much more asymmetric. Donald Trump did not spend very much money on television compared to the Clinton campaign. The ground campaign in the Clinton campaign was much larger. And so these are questions that we'll grapple with as well. So one thing is how much they're getting through, and the other thing is then how much that ultimately affect voters, if that's what you're concerned about. But again, my biggest concern with a lot of these things is much more on right-wing extremism than it is on kind of the average or marginal effect on voters.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, go ahead.
I had a question about kind of in the modern world that you all are living in, what do you see as the role for the subject matter expert or somebody that has a theory on what explains what? And given that they have a role, how do we build interdisciplinary teams and how do we communicate with one another?
I think those of us who are experts in explaining and prediction have a major role to play in the world. Unfortunately, so much of what our assumptions and our actions in the political world and beyond are built on superstition, ignorance, tradition, rather than real information and analysis. In fact, I have been screaming for years that my keys to the White House suggest a whole new way that candidates should approach campaigns. Since traditional campaigning doesn't matter, candidates should abandon the soundbite-driven, negative ad-driven campaigns. Instead, they should campaign on what they believe in, on building a grassroots foundation for those beliefs so that they have a mandate for governing if they're elected. Because when you have a mandate, you're much more likely to govern successfully and get another term. Moreover, even if you lose, if you campaign that way, you will have left your mark on history. Who remembers anything from the John Kerry campaign or the Al Gore campaign or the John McCain campaign, or even the Hillary Clinton campaign? Because they campaigned conventionally. They didn't expand our horizons. They didn't ignite our imagination. They didn't build a mandate for anything new and significant. And of course, as I explained, the big shots never listen. I've been screaming this for 30 years into the wind.
I think there is some very interesting research coming out of the 2016 election looking at the effect of predictions on voting, as well as, of course, concerns about how prediction was affecting allocation of resources and decisions that people are making during the course of the cycle. And I think that this is something that we need to worry about when it comes to predictions per se in all sorts of things. How much predictions become deterministic based off the fact that they drive decisions and then ultimately may lead to less normative outcomes than you may otherwise want. And so it's led me and others to think more about using this technology in order to do things that we may think would be more useful. Think about the same technology being used to understand better public opinion and let that drive more what people are allocating their thoughts and efforts to. I think that there's a lot of questions when you talk specifically about whether or not elites totally misunderstood people's positions on healthcare and taxes, on foreign wars in which people have very little information but are very confused and have maybe stronger underlying opinions if we educated people more or at least understood better what they thought under different conditions. And so I think that it is incumbent on anyone who has this type of influence and understanding to think through a lot about what the impact of the information they put out into the world is. And then I think that one of the things that I alluded to in my talk, which I'm very excited about though, is that on the kind of research side of it, there is a new interdisciplinary kind of a push that was not really the case 5 and 10 years ago. There's an idea called computational social science, which is relatively new, which is bringing quantitative, large-scale data across social sciences, find the right interplay between qualitative and quantitative data, cutting across disciplines in ways that were previously unseen. In the work that I do involving essentially more on the paid and earned media side, this is a literature that spans 5, 6 different disciplines. Reading academic articles is confusing because people are not just answering different questions, they're writing about it in different ways. They have different data, different techniques. Trying to bridge those gaps is very complicated because the academic communities are so segregated, right? They write in their own journals. They really don't reward cross-disciplinary work as much as they want to talk about it. And then taking the extra leap, we're very fortunate, both Jake and I, to work in a cross between academic and practitioner space, to be able to speak publicly, to be able to speak within companies, to be able to speak in the academic space is still somewhat rare. Our job is somewhat rare and very exciting for that. And trying to build those gaps, those bridges are so important because of the gaps in data, which comes from so much of this larger scale data being held in private companies. How do we make access to that in a safe and secure way, but one that advances science? And one that's really, really interesting, I'll say, with all of this is that there is a massive fight going on right now in academia over the questions of security and privacy, ethics, and moral responsibility with the data versus the quantitative researchers who want to take advantage of the data in order to learn things about the world. And so you have this massive push where there are academics who are out there saying, let's shut this down. It's too dangerous, it's too risky. And what they're really doing at the end of the day is pushing the research into companies that are then not publicly talking about it. And the example, which I always bring up, is the emotion contagion situation at Facebook. They were doing research on the effect of the newsfeed on people's emotional responses. It was published in PNAS. It was a terrible paper, but I won't blame anyone here. But basically, the fallout from the research basically was not to stop doing research on the effect of the newsfeed on people, but for Facebook to stop talking about the research they do on the effect of the newsfeed, and that is not an optimal solution for anyone.
It's on. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that
Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Thank you.
The task of building interdisciplinary teams, especially when you have people who are domain experts who have spent their lives learning about the history and the culture of a given phenomenon, is that if we want to take a scientific approach to it, then we have to move beyond just the qualitative ideas. And I think that the tools of data science and predictive analytics can allow us to be more scientific in particular. That for some phenomenon, we know so little about cause and effect that the domain experts are really the place to start. Like that basically why we think humans do certain kinds of things. But then being scientific about it requires quantifying those things, building testable hypotheses, getting the data to then test those hypotheses rigorously, guarding against things like confounding and researchers' degrees of freedom in order to sort of move our understanding more in the direction of causality. It's a long process, and doing so requires not just collaborating with people who have different skills from you, which is sort of the baby version of interdisciplinary, but actually learning those skills yourself. And I think more critically, learning how to talk like someone in that other field. So learning how to code, learning how to do your own data science, like that is going to be the key to the future of all this kind of work as we take these much more qualitative, historically qualitative ideas and try to turn them into real science.
Okay, I have a question. So my question is about 2 future global events, World War III and recession at the global level. My question to you is, and any of the panelists can answer this, can we use this emerging machine learning, artificial intelligence, data analytics to predict these global events with some kind of precision, let us say? So please don't say that, okay, it will happen in 1 year or 10 years, no. Some precision. Can we predict these global events? Thank you.
No.
I'm going to add one thing. I mostly agree with Aaron.
Thank you for short answer.
I'll add one thing which I think is kind of interesting, and I'm curious what you think of as a parallel for this, which is, people have pointed to, chaotic and unpredictable systems, as weather as an example, right? If you'd like to predict the weather very far out from now, it's very hard, right? And then, we have these apps on our phones where, it'll tell you, okay, it might rain in 5 minutes because we can watch the cloud cover coming. And I'm curious what you think about the idea of, we can't do long-term prediction, but can we do enough monitoring and, you know, sort of nowcasting and the right type of counting at the right type of frequency to be able to do something in the face of these things, or is that also kind of hopeless?
Oh, weather's a fascinating example because people have been wanting to predict the weather for as long as there has been weather. And it didn't become feasible until the middle part of the century. In fact, the first person to discover that there was a power law in the sizes of wars was Louis Fry Richardson, and he was also a forerunner in trying to develop techniques for predicting weather. And at his time, he was active in the first half of the 20th century. There wasn't enough computing power to make the predictions quick enough that they would actually be useful. Like he could make a prediction that would be done, the calculation would be done in a week for tomorrow's weather. So what's happened since then is a complete sea change in the way that we think about weather prediction. Part of it is based on models, so we understand a lot more about the physics of weather. So we understand cause and effect in a much more fine-grained sense. But even more transformative was a transformation in our data collection. We have so much information about weather now. We have sensing stations all over the world. We have them at different altitudes. They measure a dozen different features. We integrate these in terms of central databases. We make sense of them using these physics-type models. And then those models themselves still stink about 2 weeks out. And yet you can still they stink after about like 4 or 5 days out. You can make them better by using human judgment. So this is an example in which, in the weather forecasting community, they have figured out how to take the data and the algorithms and then hand adjust them based on the domain expertise of, oh, well, I know that this mountain range here creates this rigid pressure that's pretty common in this area, so I'm going to adjust the prediction for Boulder, Colorado, where I live, to account for that effect that's not built into the models. But the amount of money and energy that went into creating that capability spans hundreds of thousands of people, billions of dollars, and decades of time in order to get from the point where Richardson first worked on the idea of predicting weather to the point of having it on your app. So the idea that we could do that with something like war or recession is more likely, I think, with the recession side of things, because we are collecting data on economic indicators in various kinds of fine-grained ways. I'm not sure we understand causality there as well as maybe some other people think we do. But certainly on the conflict side, no, there's definitely not. So the general possibility of that kind of work, it's there, but we have a lot of work to do before we can actually realize that dream of being able to make reliable predictions about individual events for either the economy or conflict.
I'm delighted to hear you say, even for something as scientific as the weather, there is role for human judgment. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for one more question, sir.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time. You mentioned that predicting is very hard because of, contingency and agency, right? And you also mentioned that, these codes should be released and, for more academic research and also for verification if these codes are right. Now, especially with elections, if, contingency and agency makes things harder to predict, and we have adversaries who want to create more contingencies and have agency to influence things, then how do those two work together in terms of because if they get these codes, they're learning what we're learning, and then they can create more.
Let me answer your question with a story that I think speaks to that. When I first developed the keys, I gave them to a friend of mine. You may have heard of him. His name is Bob Shrum. He was the leading Democratic political consultant. And he calls me back and he says, I looked at your keys and I hate them. Go back to your crazy Russian friend, redo them, and come up with something that I can manipulate. In other words, the keys are very hard to manipulate. The contingent events that we think sway elections up and down, the day-to-day events, have absolutely no role in prediction and have never, ever had any predictive value. So I do think it is possible, maybe not forever, but at least to a great extent, to transcend day-to-day contingencies. Nothing that's happened, the so-called October surprise that we always hear about, nothing that's happened after the beginning of an election campaign over 34 years have ever changed one of my predictions.
So one of the things that we're trying to do is take the top stories in various types of media and see how likely they are to break into the mainstream media, and then specifically focused on different forms of swampy media, hyperpartisan, right-wing, left-wing, et cetera, et cetera. We will be doing this throughout the foreseeable future, and the idea around this type of project is that we're bringing a bunch of people in on it. We're trying to be as open within that community as possible. To Aaron's point, like if you told people how, what happens, then that would then be something that people would build towards. If you notice that certain things are pathways from one type of media to the other, then people will push on that and they'll move to other things. And so we do need to, in that case, try to think about how you bridge that divide of those two different goals of being open and getting enough people in there to make sure you're right, but then also trying to keep things quiet. But then to Jake's point, we don't think we're going to be incredibly predictive, so we're not that concerned on one side. And also, we expect these things to move so quickly, the types of publications, the pathways from one place to another, that models that we make now will be considered something to look at, but not something to worry about maybe even a year or 2 years from now, because it's such an evolving space. And so that does allow us to then quickly move into a more open space once you view them as not a security threat.
I would like to thank all of our speakers today for a very interesting panel session and also their presentations. Thank you very much. We're concluded.